lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament. And there's one specific horn who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The three stories of faithfulness despite persecution. These are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering people. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final three visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final two beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is an image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people in his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up, and so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms. It's Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that in a sense, they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus' empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong, and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
All right, our kids are dismissed. If you can get the house lights on too, please, that'd be great. Appreciate that. Well, you got it? The whirlwind, isn't it? This past week, I've really been enjoying just studying and talking about this book of Daniel. Many of you know, have some experiences with the book of Daniel, as that many of the things that are written in Daniel are thought to be about the future, about what it will be like for us. How will the world end? And Daniel is one of those books in the Bible that talks about the abomination of desolation. And many people think that that has to do with a nuclear type explosion because of the desolation that it leaves behind. And whether or not we know that or not, it doesn't change a lot of whether or not Daniel's prophecies that he proved over time are going to come true. We don't know all the details about it, but it is fascinating to think that some guy named Daniel proved over and over that he could interpret and that he could share visions, that he could see things into the future, and they were proven to come true, and then he shares a vision about the end of it all. To me, that's fascinating. And that's why today we're going to talk about this book of Daniel, about the life of Daniel. We're going to kind of go through it real quickly because there's obviously 12 chapters, and I don't have the time to get into one chapter, but I want to talk about the man here. I want to talk about the big picture of who Daniel is, what he lived, what he talked about, and even share with you a little bit about what might be expected. But today, as we begin, we're kicking off a new series. This entire month, we're going to be looking at some of the most unlikely heroes ever. And we're just going to be looking at some of the lives of different people throughout the Bible. And I want to share with you just glimpses into these people's lives that they offer some wisdom to us. And I want to share it with you today from the book of Daniel as we explore these biblical virtues that each of these people has. And I hope that we can learn from them something that we can take with us. And I know that you will as well. As the video here showed, Daniel chapters, I think I've watched this video 3 times. And to be honest with you, I remember different things about every time I watched it. So I realized the first time you've only watched it, like you just kind of like in one ear and out the other. It was just too fast. So we're going to slow it down. We're going to kind of walk through it just a little bit more as well so that you can also glean some virtues that Daniel and his life that he wants us to glean from this text in particular. So chapters 1 through 6, these were stories of Daniel's life, actual things that happened to him, things that are worth noting, things that reveal a pattern of his life and a pattern that he saw and he experienced through the course of his life. For example, Daniel would do things, or he wrote these stories down for a reason. And so the question that I would ask you is, what is that reason? What is the pattern there that Daniel is trying to show us through all of these stories that he reads? It's not just read a story and what does this have to do with me? It's read a story, but why is this story in here? Why is Daniel sharing this with us? Why is it important that I learn from this in any way, shape, or form? What is worth noting in my own personal life? And that's what I hope you'll be able to glean from it. In chapters 1 through 6 are stories from his life that are important for us to acknowledge. And then chapters 7 through 12, Daniel has these visions, these things that he sees, and these things that he doesn't necessarily understand at the time, but he's chosen and he's proven himself to be reliable because of past experiences. So when Daniel says something, keep in mind, prophets from the past, they would be killed if one of their prophecies didn't come true. So they learned either to not say anything or to actually only say things that you know are from God. Now, Daniel is one of these people that he's not only alive, but they've been taken captive. He's been put through a whole different move. He's been taken away, and yet he still continues to prove he can not only tell what God is saying and what God is doing, he's interpreted these dreams and convinced other people from the outside, non-Christians, that he has a gift from God. And because of this, it's worth recognizing, it's worth noting this unlikely hero's talent and gifting that he has as far as this goes. He's not only proven himself to be reliable and true, but it's worth it for us to note, what is the big picture? What is going on with Daniel? Like, how can I understand? How does what Daniel have to say impact me today? What can I learn from his stories? What can I learn from his life lessons? What can I learn from Daniel? I will never forget the way that I grew up in my home. I'm not sure how you are with your family when you grew up, but there was this thing my mom and dad said, I was always the one getting into trouble. And I don't really remember it that way. Okay, I don't remember it at all like that, but that's how I was. But something happened to me when I turned, it was in my 20s, maybe young 20s, and I started to realize that there's 2 ways to learn. You can either learn from other people's mistakes or you can make them yourself. And it was like a light bulb went on inside of my head and said, you know what? Instead of learning the hard way, be it intentional or unintentional or accidental, we'll call it, maybe I should start paying attention better to people around me and learning from their mistakes so I don't have to repeat them. I'm guessing for most of you that at some point in time in your life that has happened to you or will happen to you as well. When you'll start to realize there's got to be a better way to learn these things than making these mistakes myself. Well, I learned a lot of things the hard way at first, but for some reason, something inside my learning ability changed, and I call it wisdom. It's something that God gave to me, or God opened up, or God made me realize, hey, look, there's a better way to do things, and you really need to learn them, and you need to understand them. And I think that one of the messages that comes along with that is very similar to this book in Daniel, is that there's always hope for us. It's never too late to start letting God use and teach you wisdom instead of having to learn the hard way. And there's a better way to do things that each of us should be willing to grasp. That's the way I was raised. That's the way I grew up. And that's who I was for many, many years. But doing what is right before God, regardless of our consequences, is no small task. And I realize everybody here gets this. It's not always easy to do what's right. But Daniel is teaching us something through his whole book, something that most of us learn at some point in time, that it's going to cost you something if you choose to do things the right way. It's going to cost you something if you choose to do things the way that God wants you to do them. And it may not be easy, it may not be something that you want to pay for, but it will be worth it. I will never forget a time, and I can relate with Daniel here. Many of you make the connections here. It was the second church that Julie and I had ever worked at as youth pastor. And the pastor there, he pulled us aside about 3-4 months in, and he said, I want you to start charging extra at youth events for retreats and things like that, so that we can put money into the building fund. And I looked at him, and I couldn't believe that my boss, the pastor, was telling me this. And I'm sitting there thinking, that just doesn't seem right. And I was young, and I didn't necessarily always make good decisions, but I talked with Julie about it, and I said, you know what? I said, I'm not comfortable doing this at all. And I think, honestly, that it's wrong. What's a few extra bucks, right? Well, about a couple weeks later, I started to realize that he was charging for these daily bread devotionals that are free from a company that produces them. Now, the company asks the church for donations, but I told him, I says, I think that this is a problem here, that you're charging people for daily bread devotionals. And he looked at me and he said, this goes back to the whole charging extra money for the youth things. And I said, yeah. I said, I think there's a problem here with money. I said, you've got $250,000 in the bank for this new building fund, and you're pushing for more and more and more, but you're not asking people for it. You're kind of taking it from other areas. And I said, I got a problem with this. Can we talk about this and work through this? And he just looked at me and he said, this is what I want you to do. Don't ever bring this up again. Oh, okay, that's like 2 strikes out with the money issue. And even to this day, if you guys know me, I don't like anything with money at church. I like it, if it is what it is what it is. If it's something different, then call it something different. Everything has got to be very transparent and very clear. And this is because of this man. This man intentionally was looking to do more and more and more, and he was, I don't know, in my opinion, was it really that big of a deal? Yeah. Where was his heart at? What was he? Why was he trying to do these things in a way that seemed deceptive? And to me, it was wrong. And so Julie and I, we talked about it, and I said, this is not looking good. I said, I don't know what's going to happen. And we pretty much said, you know what? We're going to stand with what we know is right before God, regardless of the consequences. We don't care. And the impact of making this decision was felt not only by us, but was felt by our family. Well, I guess we didn't have kids at the time, but it was felt by us. It was felt by the housing we had chosen. Everything we had done to make this decision to be there and to begin this new relationship was changed because it costed us to do what was right before God. Not only did I lose my job, I can safely tell you that a couple of months later, he lost his job. And I'm very thankful for that. We took a stand for what we knew was right. And we said, look, there's a bigger problem going on here if this is his idea of managing church funds. And we told the church that, and I don't even know why they let him go exactly, but I know they let him go. And it wasn't my goal to let him go. It was my goal to stand up for what I believe was right. You do not do things shady like that, ever, before God, let alone at church. I took a stand for something that I thought was right, and it cost me a lot. It is no small task. And you want to talk about the connection with Daniel? This is a man who stood up for what was right. And it cost him dearly, numerous times. And yet, before God, he said, I want to do what's right before God, regardless if before men it cost me my life. If I can encourage you in anything from the book of Daniel and my own personal life, it would be this. Things are going to happen. And doing what's right before God is the best answer. It sure didn't feel like it that Monday morning. It sure didn't feel like it for a couple of months afterwards. But I knew what we did was right. And years later, I knew what I did was right. Just like Daniel did. And that's why I want to study him a little bit more. I want to look at what he talked about. I want to look at what he did. Because doing what's right before God, regardless of the consequences, is no small task. And everyone in this room knows it. Unfortunately, we know it too well. Sometimes we don't want to hear it, but it's the truth. This brings us to Daniel. If you have your Bible, I encourage you guys to bring it all this month in particular. We are going to be going through several different books of the Bible, and we're kind of doing a survey here today, and I encourage you, pull out those Bibles, use them. You're more than welcome to jot down notes in your Bible as we survey these pages, as we survey the story, and I encourage you to write it down because you'll remember it a whole lot better. And be aware you may get wet on this ride too. So there are 12 chapters in the book of Daniel, and I just don't have the time to really do any of it justice, but we are going to kind of skim through it. And I'm going to give you two verses, one kind of an opening verse or a paragraph that tells you kind of what this chapter is about, or the heart of it, and then one's kind of a closing verse or paragraph that also tells you the heart of the conclusion of why this story is in here. And when it comes to the end, I just want to recap for you the big picture of what we're talking about here, and why this unlikely hero has some wisdom for each of us, that we can either learn from somebody else's experiences or mistakes, or we can make them ourselves. And so I want you to hear this, and I want you to see this, and I want you to apply this today to our own current political, national environment, and see how it all fits together, and there's wisdom here to the one. Daniel chapter 1, a little bit of background here. The Israelites had been exiled to Babylon. In other words, they were taken as slaves because of their arrogance and sinfulness. Basically, they just didn't make very good decisions, and there were consequences before God for that. So the first verse I want to share with you comes from Daniel chapter 1. And it says this, it says, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine that he was being forced to eat. And he asked the chief officials for permission not to defile himself this way." So here you have Daniel being captured by these people, being acknowledged as somebody who is smart and before God seems to be gifted. They acknowledge that, they pull him into his, and then they force him to eat and to do the things that they want him to do. And Daniel asks his boss or his overseer, "Look, I don't want to eat the foods that you guys are requiring us to eat because they violate my religion, my faith." And so Daniel asks not only for himself, but he also asks for his 3 other additional friends, 4 of them in total, to be presented after a certain amount of time. And then if they are found to be healthier or better than others, then to be granted this permission to do what is right, what they knew was right before God. And so at the end of the book of Daniel chapter 1, we read this. "At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they entered the king's service. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Now, I don't know about you, I love meat. 4th of July, we had meat on the grill. So I'm not saying that vegetables makes you smarter. I'm saying that God's involvement in people's lives and doing what they say is the blessing. That's where it's at. You're supposed to do what God wants you to do. And it may make sense to somebody else, and it may not make sense to somebody else. It's up to you. It's between you and God. But that's what Daniel is teaching here in this first chapter. This is the message that he's saying. Look, I took a stand for something I believed in. And God blessed it. God blessed it in a way I could have never expected. And I wish Daniel could be up here telling you this story. I mean, it would be fascinating to hear the stories that he saw and that he knew. That's Daniel chapter 1. Let's zip up to Daniel chapter 2. And this is where we're introduced more specifically to King Nebuchadnezzar, because he has this dream. And he can't find anybody that can interpret it for him. Or he can't find anybody that can tell him what the dream is and interpret it for him more specifically. And it's fascinating. I want you to notice how Daniel does this, and the real kicker at the end here is so important. In the 2nd year of his reign, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and in his mind he was troubled, and so therefore he could not sleep. And so Daniel goes on, and the king goes on, and he gathers all of his people together, and he says, hey, can you guys not only tell me what my dream is, but can you interpret it for me? That's how I'll know that you're real. Now, what do you think that feels like? Well, if you read the text, you find out that the king eventually gets angry with all of these people and says, look, guys, if you can't do it. Okay? So they all start to freak out. Later on in Daniel chapter 2, if you want to read the whole book, you're welcome to do that. But Daniel eventually replies to the king, and he says, there's no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery that he has asked us about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Your dream and your visions that pass through your mind are as you were lying in bed are these. And Daniel goes on to explain to him his dream. There's the one thing here that Daniel does better than anyone else. And I think it's worth noting here, especially in chapter 2. And it goes in this, verse 28. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. You see, Daniel could have taken all of this claim for himself. He could have said, yeah, king, I can do this. I just fixed my pool pump yesterday. I can handle this. No big deal, right? How many times do we think that? But when was the last time we actually gave God credit for the things that took place in our lives? Daniel, not only did he not accept any of this praise or adoration for himself, he simply said, God can do it. And he stopped trusting himself and stopped trusting this, and he actually recognized and gave God the recognition for what took place. And so in Daniel chapter 2, not only does Daniel do something miraculous that no one else can do, is 10 times better than all the other wise men and enchanters, but Daniel acknowledged God before the king and said, nobody here can do it, but God can. But God can. And I can't even imagine what was going through Daniel's mind as he's standing there next to the king. And he's telling him this story. I don't know, did Daniel just make it up? Did Daniel have the dream the night before and he knew what the king was talking about? How do you tell somebody what their dream is without knowing it, let alone interpret it? Daniel impressed the king big time. And he gave all the credit to God. Steve, thanks for sharing your story this morning. You talked about going out there and how you guys just felt going back to that rest area that God wanted you to do it. Man, listening to God is more important than anything. Nowhere in the Bible you're going to say, hey, yeah, the Bible told me to go back to the rest area. You're not going to read that in there. But you listened and you responded to what God wanted you to do, and on top of it, you gave God all the credit. It wasn't about Steve. It was about God. And that's the right way to do these things. We read this in Daniel chapter 2, while Daniel interprets this dream, this first dream for the king. Moving on to Daniel chapter 3. Many of you know this is the fiery furnace chapter. There are 3 men who were thrown into a fiery furnace because They would not bow down. They would not obey the law of the land, and they would not violate their religion and their faith in God. They took a stand for something. And so this verse here puts it in perspective. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what everyone is commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and the pipe, and all of these kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up over you. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. And you guys all know the story, but what's the virtue? Why is this in here? Why is Daniel telling this story as something of importance, is the question. And I want you to read this here with me, the conclusion of chapter 3. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent this angel into the fire and rescued his servants. They trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god, lowercase g, than their own, the real God." Man, the character. Now, Daniel's telling the story. I wondered, where's Daniel at in all this? Daniel's telling the story of Rakshak and Abednego, but Daniel's not there. He's not involved in this situation. I don't know, maybe he was playing one of the instruments. I'm not sure where Daniel was, but he's saying, look, this is another story of people doing what's right before God, regardless of the consequences. That's what this story is all about. Doing what's right before God, regardless of the consequences. And that's why this chapter, chapter 3, is so important for us to remember. It's not about 3 men being thrown in a fiery furnace. It's about 3 men taking a stand to do what's right before God, not before other people. The chapter 4 and 5, if you remember from the video, these two are connected. These two are about a father and a son, King Nebuchadnezzar and his son, King Belshazzar, who eventually takes over as his son. And there's a fair amount of time that takes place in here. All of these stories didn't just happen like the next day. This is a part of Daniel's life story. And this is a story of pride and arrogance. I don't know if you know of anybody that has an issue with pride and arrogance. There are several people in political features that have pride and arrogance, and we know them, we see them, we recognize them. But today, I want you to consider something about this message here. It's not that we don't know people who are pride and arrogant. The question is, who do they give the glory to? And I want you to think about this for a moment in a very unique way. This is the interpretation. Daniel has an interpretation for King Nebuchadnezzar's dream again. This is the interpretation, Your Majesty, and this is the decree that the Most High has issued against my Lord, King. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass for you until you acknowledge, this is the kicker here, that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on this earth, and he gives them to anyone. Is there another? Yeah, anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots, the vision, is that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, Your Majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed, so that then your prosperity may continue. You see, here you've got a guy, King Nebuchadnezzar, arrogant and prideful, makes all the rules, does what he wants. But the moment he acknowledges God, everything changes. The pride and arrogance may still be there, but he acknowledges God, and so things change. It doesn't say here that he became the most humble person in the world. It doesn't say here that he changed his personality or the way that he was raised. What does it say? It says he acknowledged God and that he's not God. Can I give you some wisdom here from this chapter here? Daniel chapter 4 is not about arrogant people. It's not about prideful people, because there's all kinds of people in this world. It's about the people that acknowledge God or don't. And I want you to think about that. Yeah, I may not be friends with a prideful or arrogant person because I just don't like being around them. But a person who acknowledges God, I don't have anything to say against them. Let God be their judge. How about you? How do you feel about this? What do you think Daniel's trying to say here about this? What's most important here in this whole passage? What is God trying to teach King Nebuchadnezzar? Oh, and it doesn't stop there because his son isn't even any better. Look at chapter 5, where his son has a different outcome. In Daniel chapter 5, the first passage I want to just summarize for you real quick. But you, Belshazzar, King Nebuchadnezzar's son, you have not humbled yourself. And though you knew all of this that he's teaching, instead you set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from the Israelites' temple, from the Jewish temple brought to you. You, your nobles, your wives, your concubines, they all drank from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. They cannot see or hear or understand anything. But you did not honor the God who holds his hand in your life, in all of your ways. Therefore, he sent this hand that wrote the inscription on the wall. Now, many of you guys know the story of Belshazzar and Daniel. It's the handwriting on the wall story, where God wrote on the wall of this king, and the king didn't really understand why God was writing his hand, but he was totally freaked out. And so he gathered Daniel. Daniel read to him and explained to him what the meaning was of this writing on the wall. And it was not good. And so I leave you with this conclusion about Belshazzar. That very night, Belshazzar, who did not acknowledge God, who did not change his ways, and did not acknowledge the fact that there was a God and he wasn't it, the king of the Babylonians was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. There's two ways to handle things when it comes to pride and arrogance. You can either humble yourself and respect what God has told you to do, or two, you can die in your arrogance. Those are the choices that Daniel's teaching here. Two different people, two different outcomes. Two different conclusions, worth knowing. That's part of the reason why 4 and 5 go together. Father and son. Pride and arrogance. One acknowledged God at the end of it, and one didn't. There's wisdom there. There's virtue there, worth all of us noting. Chapter 6, the lion's den. Many of you know this story as well, and so I just kind of got to breathe through it here real quickly. But now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators, the satraps, by his exceptional qualities, that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, I love jealousy, the administrators, the satraps, they tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel and in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. So what did they do next? Set him up, right? They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And finally, these men all gathered together and said, "We will never find any basis for charges against Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." And so they set up a trap for him. Many of you know the story of Daniel in the lion's den, where they set the trap for Daniel, and Daniel did what he always did. And even if you can imagine his life story up to this point in time, he's done so many things. He's going to do what's right before God, regardless of the consequences. He doesn't care what people come up with or say. And so sure enough, most of you guys know the story, Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den. And what happens? Well, same thing with the fiery furnace. Okay? Nothing. But what does the king acknowledge and do whenever he comes and retrieves Daniel? Watch this, or listen to this. "I issued a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion will never end. For he rescues and he saves people. He performs signs and wonders in heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." Here you have King Darius, not Belshazzar, not King Nebuchadnezzar. This is Darius, who's acknowledging again the God of Daniel is unlike anything he's ever seen before. And once again, you have a king who's arrogant and prideful and think the world revolves around him and has grapes and people fanning him with palm leaves. You have a guy from this saying, you know what? I'm going to recognize the God of Daniel as being the real God. There is something real here, unbelievably real. So moving on to chapter 7 here just real quickly. It goes real fast here. Chapter 7, Daniel begins, this is the new series. These are not life lessons anymore. These are Daniel's visions. He has 3 primary visions where he starts to interpret them and he starts to talk about them. He's trying to tangibly relate these visions. And so Daniel has dreams of the future, and some of them are the immediate future and some of them are the future yet to come. We don't know exactly what the interpretation is, but it says this in Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream. And these visions passed through his mind as he was laying down in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dreams. And if you want to read more about chapter 7, you're more than welcome to do the substance and kind of look at the history that took place there with the king. Chapter 8 also goes on, it continues on in the dreams. Noah, can you tag the next one, please? Sorry, I know it's going to go fast. This was chapter 7, chapter 8. Well, in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision. And after that one, and after the one that had already appeared to me, and Daniel continued to have these visions about what would happen in the kingdoms and what was going to happen. And it was fascinating. It was fun to learn. It was fun to hear. But these were more evidences that these people trusted Daniel when he had visions. They were evidences that what Daniel was saying and hearing and doing, that they had to take him seriously, sometimes to their own demise. Daniel chapter 9, Daniel says, I prayed to the Lord my God, and I confessed, Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned. We have done something wrong. We have been wicked and we have rebelled. We have turned away from your commands and laws. And Daniel in this chapter is begging that the Lord does not do as he said he would do in the dreams that Daniel had. Not because of his own personal failures or sin, but because of the sin of the nation of Israel. Because of what the people were doing. And we have a story here. If you want to read about it, you're welcome. But Daniel fears for not only his, but all of the Jews, all of the Israelites. He fears for all these people. Because he knows when he has these dreams, they come true. And people have to turn back and look towards God. Daniel chapter 10, and then he continues on. Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding, to humble yourself before God, your words have been heard. I have come in response to them, says the angel. Now I have come to explain to you what will happen to the people in the future, and for the visions that concern a time that is yet to come. Daniel chapter 11, it starts out, and in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support him. It's a fascinating read if you get a chance to read Daniel chapter 11. But it starts out as Daniel once again taking a stand for what's right and not being willing to back down, to support his king when other people are questioning him, to stand up for what's right before God, because this king here has also acknowledged who God is. And though Daniel may not be best friends with King Darius, he acknowledges the role that he has, accepts it, and acknowledges the fact that King Darius has received, has accepted, and has given God great the authority that he has. The last chapter, chapter 12, is the one that most people refer to. It's a little bit more maybe near end times-ish. It says, at that time Michael, the great prince who protects our people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise, oh, I love this part. To those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. The whole book of Daniel I encourage you to read on your own. But I want to ask you this. Can you learn from somebody else's experiences? Can you learn something from the book of Daniel? Daniel's book of virtues here reveals a pattern and a reoccurring promise that we can learn from. And it has to do with somebody else making a mistake. And we can either make that exact same mistake ourselves, or we can learn from it. And I want to encourage you, read the book of Daniel. Read some of these chapters. Read one chapter, read 12. There's wisdom there. There's a message there. These are not just Bible stories. They're stories that have a pattern and have a message. Part of the pattern of what's being revealed, as the video talked about, is that human beings easily become arrogant and ugly beasts when they don't acknowledge God. And I know that that's nobody here in this room, but the truth of the matter is that anybody in this room has the potential to wake up one morning and realize you have turned into an arrogant and ugly beast, and nobody wants to be around you. And the book of Daniel simply teaches us this message. Recognize who God is. Acknowledge Him, and acknowledge that you are not. And those who do that live. Those who do that are called wise. And those who don't. The second thing that this entire book summarizes and puts to us is a promise. A promise is something that we can hold on to. And in particular, it's revealed here through the visions, but it's also revealed through the life stories as a pattern that repeats itself. And that is that God has, and God always will confront wrongdoing, the beasts all around us. And God not only will He promises to confront them, but He also promises to save those who acknowledge Him. I simply want to encourage you. You don't have to read the whole book of Daniel to know these two things, that there are ugly beasts out there, and two, that God will always, He always has and He always will rescue those who acknowledge Him. So my encouragement for you today is this. Are you acknowledging God in your life? Through the stories, through the dreams, and through the life lessons that we can learn from someone else? Or are you going to make these mistakes yourself? The relevant point is this. Daniel, our unlikely hero, has a message of humility and hope that motivates all of us to acknowledge God. King Nebuchadnezzar, a man we can learn from, had this conclusion at the end of his life that he wanted to say about the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He said, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, I will praise and I will exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything He does is right, and all of His ways are just, and those who walk in pride, He is able to humble." Please stand with me and close in word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank You for Daniel and the life lessons that he experienced, that he wrote down, and he wrote for us. I pray, Father, that You'd give us wisdom and understanding. Maybe the ability, Lord, to learn from somebody else's mistakes would benefit us. I pray, Father, that today You would help us, Lord, to recognize and to realize that Your word is there to encourage us. Help us, Lord, to recognize and realize that we need to acknowledge You in all that we say and do. We need to work, Lord, to make sure that we maintain healthy relationships, but proper relationships in all that we say and do as well. Help us, Father, to have a better relationship with You as a result of understanding and knowing Daniel and the 12 books that he wrote. We want to praise You and thank You, Lord, for today. In Your name we pray. Amen. I want to remind you that all Scripture is God-breathed. Take it with you this week.